Those of you who don't know me, my name is Shona Mortier. I direct the Center for Civil Society. So welcome to this CCS webinar. As you know, our seminar series that used to be in the physical space has moved online. And today I'm introducing Danford Chipvon-Godse and Andries Matau, who facilitate this series. And the series is on debates around decolonization and what that means and how that's happening in various spaces and the various processes and the ways that we are thinking about it. And today we are so thrilled to welcome Remi Joseph-Salisbury, who is a Presidential Fellow in Ethnicities and Inequalities at the University of Manchester. And Remi's works on race, racism, anti-racism. He is very involved in policing. He's interested in education and policing. He's authored a number of reports, which you can find if you look him up. He's also the author of Black Mixed Race Men and the co-author of The Fire Now, Anti-Racism in Times of Explicit Racial Violence. And he's currently working on another book on anti-racist scholar-activism, which is the topic of his seminar today, Anti-Racist Scholar-Activism as Decolonial Praxis in British Universities. So Remi, a very warm welcome. We're so excited to have you. And I'm going to hand over now to either Danford or Andries, who are going to facilitate. Dan, Andries.
Thank you very much, Shona. Remi, welcome to the Center for Civil Society. I'm Andries Matau. To everyone that has joined us, you're welcome. Just simple house rules. Please make sure that your mics and your videos are off. And if you have any pressing questions on you, you can raise your visual hand or type them in the chat bar. We're looking forward to having this conversation with Remi today. And Remi, you've got about 30 minutes to do a presentation. And then after we'll have a question and answer session. But for everyone else, please text your questions. And if you have any inputs, you will take them at the end of the webinar. Remi, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just ask you to bear with me whilst I figure out how to share my screen. I have some slides. Okay, can you see those slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great. So thank you for the invitation. Really glad to be here and in conversation with you all, and I look forward particularly to the discussion. So the presentation I'm going to give today is based on ongoing work, or my current work, with Laura Connolly at the University of Salford, and we are researching anti-racist scholar activism in British universities. And this is due to be published with Manchester University Press as a book in 2021. We're due to submit it in January. So as you can imagine, these ideas are really swirling around in our minds at the moment, really at the forefront of our minds as we're trying to get the manuscript together. This is the first time I think either of us has spoken about the topic, drawing on the data. So really would welcome any thoughts and critical thoughts and a conversation afterwards. Okay, so I'll give you a bit of a background to the research. So based on research conversations with 28 anti-racist scholar activists who are working in British universities, we use this term anti-racist scholar activist quite broadly. I think those that we spoke to didn't necessarily all identify in this way, but they either self-identified as a scholar activist, were identified by others as scholar activists, or were involved in scholar activist networks or events, explicitly scholar activist networks. But even those that did identify in this way generally had a number of caveats and critical thoughts about the utility of the term. So we use it in a really broad sense, and we think it also overlaps with related terms like activist scholar, activist academic, academic activist, intellectual activist, which we take from Patricia Hill Collins, guerrilla intellectual, which we take from Walter Rodney, subversive intellectual, we draw on from Stefano Hani and Fred Moulton, and troublemakers, which is a term that several people that we spoke to said used to self-identify or describe the way that they were seen in the university. So we're capturing all this in our definition of scholar activists. To put it simply, which I hope suffices for the sake of this presentation, would say that we're generally using the term to refer to academics who are engaged in some form of anti-racist activism. So we spoke to a range of people from different racial, ethnic and national backgrounds. The majority were people of colour or racial minorities in Britain, and there were also several white people who were involved in anti-racist scholar activism. Came from across several disciplines, mainly clustering in the humanities and social sciences and arts, and also spread across career stage from early career academics up to full professors. I think it's important to say that we identify ourselves within this tradition, and that comes through in our writing and I think feeds into our analysis. So we're particularly involved here in Manchester with activism around the abolition of policing or resistance to policing and over-policing. So in this project, we're interested in the practices of scholar activists. It's a primary interest. How do scholar activists engage in their work? How do they operate? How do they navigate the university? But tied in with that, we're also interested in developing a critique of the contemporary university, the neoliberal university. And we think that there's a particularly interesting critique to be made through the eyes of those who are engaged in activist or subversive challenging work within the university. And one small caveat that I think is worth flagging is just to say, and this is a rather obvious point, but the nature of our project means that it needs repeating, is that not all scholar activists work in universities. I think this is an important point in terms of us decentering the university as the site of knowledge production, which of course is part of the decolonize movement, to show that the university is not the totality of the knowledge that we have in our societies, but also to recognize that scholarly activist work that goes on in community centres, in the grassroots outside of the university, which often I think is far more effective than what is going on in universities. So all that said, in this presentation, I want to focus on two ideas in particular from the research and that are central to the book. And these make up two of the chapters from the book. So as you can imagine, this really is a quick overview of these ideas, but hopefully it gives us plenty to have some discussion around. So the two ideas are working in service and stealing from the university. Some of you may already be familiar with these ideas. So working in service, this is an idea that we take from the work of Ambalavana Sivanandan, the late Sri Lankan activist and writer. He's been a leading anti-racist thinker and activist in Britain. So reflecting on his directorship of the Institute of Race Relations, he said, there was a plethora of grassroots community movements at the time, unlike now, alas, that we could serve. If we could not be at the barricades in the fight for racial justice, we could at least be servitors in that cause. We could do research that spoke to the issues and problems confronting Black communities. We could be a servicing station. We could put gas in the tanks of Black and third world peoples on their way to liberation. So really underpinning his own philosophy, his orientation and his vision for the Institute of Race Relations is this idea of working in service. And for those who are unfamiliar, the Institute of Race Relations in the UK has been, continues to be a radical anti-racist think tank, and it became radical under the direction of Sivanandan and his colleagues. Now, several of those that we spoke to were directly influenced by Sivanandan's idea of service. It is a key inspiration for their praxis. But even those who didn't trace directly the idea to Sivanandan, they conveyed agreement with the broad sentiment that we should be working to serve those that Sivanandan called communities of resistance. And the idea of working in service, it also appears in the writing of Patricia Hill Collins, who suggests that intellectual activism, as she refers to it, describes the myriad ways in which people place the power of their ideas in service to social justice. So this idea of service is really foundational, we argue, to scholar activism, to anti-racist scholar activism. And it's one of the consistent themes across the accounts of our participants. So we would suggest that this is a key and an incredibly generative idea for scholar activist praxis. Okay, so to look at some of the insights of our participants, we can see this idea in this account from Oliver, a Black man community organizer who is in mid-career. And he says, I'm an academic and scholar, but actually I'm a public intellectual, which means I'm owned by the community and there to service the community. I'm a public intellectual who happens to have access to a range of resources through the academy. So he offers this as a definition of public intellectualism. His position is counter-hegemonic. It troubles and pushes against the assumption that we work primarily for the university. Instead, he works for and is owned by the community. This is a really subversive and resistant framing of the work of academics, I think. His definition of public intellectualism runs counter to the increasingly common framing of the public intellectual as somebody who writes in ways that are accessible to and targeting the general public. Instead, Oliver's speaking of an intellectual who services the public. And I think there are several advantages or several useful elements of thinking about our work as working in service to the communities. So it's a counter-hegemonic orientation, and it offers a corrective to traditional approaches to academic work. It offers us several reminders. The first of these, I think, is it reminds us whose side we are on. By talking about working in service to communities of resistance, it is clear that we're on the side of those communities rather than the side of the university. It also encourages us to remember why we do this work. And that's not for individual gain or career progression or to extract, but it's to service communities of resistance. And thirdly, it encourages us to push back against power dynamics that can emerge in movements that often elevate academics as a kind of intellectual vanguard for movements. So by positioning ourselves as in service to those movements, we're not positioning ourselves as the leader of those movements. And I think that's quite important in terms of the way power can play out in these activist movements. So just a caveat that I wanted to offer before looking at this in a bit more detail. And this comes from Alison, a white community organizer who works on issues related to racist policing. It's easy to romanticize social movements from the academy, and I think this is partly why this is important. It's important that we remain critical, and this is what Alison speaks to. She says that we need to question this assumption that your politics and your ideas align so neatly with that social movement, and therefore you would work unquestionably in service. So with this in mind, we'd suggest that it's perhaps more useful to think of our service as ultimately being to the broader project of anti-racism or racial justice, rather than individual social movements. Of course, in pursuit of that racial justice, we will necessarily work with communities of resistance. But what we're saying essentially is that if we're working with an activist group and the direction of travel is regressive or is reactionary or is not necessarily taking us towards the anti-racist progress that we need to see, then of course we should be prepared to question that rather than just deferring in absolute terms to the movements. And I think unquestionably is the key word there in Alison's account. Okay, so I want to highlight 3 key ways that working in service manifests. The first that you can see there on the slide is in terms of accountability. So to work in service, I think, is to be accountable, to make oneself accountable to communities of resistance and to that broader project of anti-racism. For many of those that we spoke to, accountability involves or comes from embeddedness in communities of resistance. And Maria spoke to this, a white organizer who works on policing and education, amongst other issues. She says, this work takes time in a community and it takes relationships. And the relationships, I think, are the most fundamental part. And for me to do it ethically, it involves me having personal relationships with people that are regular relationships where there's accountability, especially being a white person within the discipline and working around issues of race. So that's going to take time, but it's a thing that I'm committed to doing if I stay in a place, and it's always my central goal. So she highlights the importance of showing up, building meaningful relationships, and investing time in the communities that we work within. Walter Rodney spoke about the need for the guerrilla intellectual to fully commit themselves to the masses by grounding with them. And there seems to be, I think, parallels here in Maria's account with those ideas. It's important to recognise that this work swims against the tide of the neoliberal university, where time is squeezed, commodified, and time is used and time used in this way is not rewarded or recognised by the university. It's far easier for academics to develop really superficial and hollow relationships with communities and be rewarded for that, rather than doing the actual work that Maria describes here. So making this time, I think we can see as a subversive act, and perhaps even a decolonial act if we think about the coloniality of time. The second, sorry, just to go back to accountability there, one thing that I wanted to add as well is that direct accountability that Maria describes is vitally important, and I think we should strive to develop that through our networks within the university and outside of the university. But we'd also argue that this accountability also needs to take on an imagined element as well. And we say this because it's not really practical or ethical for us to constantly expect communities of resistance to check in, to manage, and to do additional labour to validate our work. Of course, we should create opportunities for that to happen, but we should not be looking for those communities to do that labour for us. Moreover, we might often be working on issues that are so vast, so international, that we can never actually hope to be in contact with all of those who are affected by the issues we organise on. And I'm thinking of issues like climate change here and its impact on the global south. So it's important that we have a broader conception of accountability that goes beyond just those immediate communities we work with. Of course, though, that direct accountability is important. So the second manifestation of working in service, I would suggest, comes from the idea of usefulness, the usefulness of our work, or that our work should be useful to communities of resistance and anti-racism. So Sajid speaks to this. He, a researcher, Asian researcher who looks at the impact, the racialized and racist impact of counter-terror on Muslim communities in particular. And he says, your research agenda is often derived from your involvement in community or grassroots organizations.
And by desktop.
And campaigns and movements. To me, that's where good research comes from. It doesn't come from a research gap or a gap in the literature. And I think often that can be the worst excuse to do a project, because I've seen a gap in the literature. And I don't think that should be a motivation to do a project. For me, it's about how socially useful is your research? How socially useful is your academic work? So again, like accountability, for Sajid, this sense of usefulness can be better determined through our involvement with communities of resistance rather than the university. So it's a reframing, a reorientation of our positions of academics. Third, pertains to accessibility. That is to say, is our work accessible to the communities we claim to be working with and for? And Thomas speaks to this. Thomas is a Black organiser who works on a range of anti-racist issues, particularly policing. He says, I do a lot more kind of audio-visual academic work than most academics, which I think is a lot more accessible than writing in a journal and in incomprehensible language. As I mentioned before, I go to schools and community centres and teach on the same topic as I wrote my highbrow thesis. And I deliver workshops on the same topic. So I think what's key here, and this is an important point, is that Thomas isn't talking about completely rejecting any writing in academic forms. He, like many others that we spoke to, recognised the importance of writing for different audiences, whether that's academic publishing, just in terms of keeping one's job, or writing in certain formats to target powerful actors. That is, the work that we're doing might not necessarily need to always be targeted at communities of resistance to be in service to communities of resistance. So despite the stereotypes of scholar activists as anti-intellectual, many of those we spoke to, like Thomas, really valued academic rigour, intellectualism, and they held very, very high standards of themselves and others. So the point is that there has to be some effort towards meaningful engagement with communities of resistance. And Thomas encapsulates this as he talks about moving between audiences. And a lot of those that we spoke to were really adept at and committed to doing this. Okay, so hopefully that sets out the idea of working in service as a bit of a foundation, I think, for scholar-activist praxis. So I now want to think a little bit about this idea of theft. Okay, so the idea of theft or stealing from the university, this is one that we take from Stefano Hani and Fred Moulton. It's articulated in their 2013, I think 2004 as well, work in the Undercommons. They say that one can only sneak into the university and steal what one can, abuse its hospitality, spite its mission, join its refugee colony, its gypsy encampment, be in but not of. This is the path of the subversive intellectual in the modern university. The subversive intellectual came under false pretenses, with bad documents, out of love. Her labour is as necessary as it is unwelcome. So this understanding is entirely underpinned by a critique of the university, an understanding that the university is underpinned by white supremacy and colonialism, and that the university actively reproduces racialized capitalism, coloniality, and the related structural inequalities. So from this understanding, from this structural radical critique of the university, comes an imperative for us to push against the university, to steal what we can, to subvert it, and to be in but not of the university. I think this idea, it ties in nicely with the idea of working in service. I think both of them reflect a counter-hegemonic orientation. We're in but not of the university, because we are of and with communities of resistance. We are in the university to serve communities of resistance, and we can do this by stealing. So if we see the university as a colonial space, then we can see theft from that university as a decolonial act. I like the idea of being in service. The idea of theft was articulated explicitly by a number of our participants again. And they were directly familiar with this work from Hani and Moulton. Others articulated broad agreement with the sentiment or ideas. So I've got a couple of examples of this. The first from Galiev, an anti-racist organizer, an Asian man who does a range of work on issues to do with racial justice in the UK. He says, it's a form of redistribution. I think that's what we've got to remember. I think that what we've got to remember is that the university has a massive accumulation of not just economic capital, but social capital. That social and economic capital is not entirely self-generated. That comes off being able to exploit the social and economic capital of people that work within, but also outside of the university. And people within the university that may not necessarily be academics. So the service staff, the catering staff, security, those members of staff who in the UK are often forgotten or left out of our movement. I think because of that, the people outside of the university are fully entitled to use the resources that the university often excludes them from. It's a form of redistributive justice in that we've got to recognise the exploitation that the university engages in. So as with Hani and Moulton, there's a clear understanding that the university is built on ill-gotten gains, that it continues to exploit its wealth and power is not self-generated. So in this sense, the theft can be thought of as a form of redistribution. This is a really important point that shows that theft from the university to benefit or in service to communities of resistance is an act of racial justice. The emphasis of theft continues to be important because it makes clear that this work is subversive and pushes against the university from within. It often requires a degree of duplicity or fugitivity. And Aliyah conveyed a similar point. She said, I like the idea of just exploiting the university and its resources, everything, because it's exploiting my students and my colleagues, so I don't owe it anything. That's really how I feel. So at the base, again, is this understanding that the university is an unjust space. It exploits, so it should be exploited. It should be exploited in service to communities of resistance. So what does this look like in practice? So Aziz Chowdhury says that despite changing times and notwithstanding all of the pressures of new academics to publish and perform in certain ways, there remain possibilities to use resources and locations in universities in service of struggles and movements. Again, we see that idea of working in service. Now, I think this is an important intervention. It's important to recognise that there are many barriers to this work, including work and time pressures, performance management mechanisms, surveillance, and so on. And of course, those forms of surveillance are felt more by racially minoritised, and particularly Muslim academics. And it's important to acknowledge all of this so as not to romanticise the possibilities within the university. But nevertheless, as I think Aziz Chowdhury makes clear, there are pockets of opportunities in universities that can be leveraged. There are resources that can be stolen. And this is the reason why those we spoke to operated within the university. It's the reason that I operate in the university, and I'm sure it's the reason many of us on this call are in the university. So in practice, this theft is most obviously and immediately manifest in terms of funding or money. As Sajid says, funding is a massive one. Can we write them community projects into a project or funding bid? I think that's what academics can do. So there's writing groups into funding bids, but there's also funds for public engagement activities that we can draw on, a range of funding opportunities in the university that we can access to benefit communities of resistance. And of course, with some of these, we might need to be particularly creative or duplicitous in the way that we frame these. That is to say that what's articulated in the applications is perhaps not entirely reflective of the work that actually gets done in what Moulton and Harney would call the undercommons, where the work gets subverted. But like the reparations movement, it's also about more than the economic and financial. So, or the immediately financial at least. Rosa speaks to this when she argues that it can also be human time or labour that we can take for the university. Can we sneak time out of our working day to do activist work? Can we set up our academic work in a way that better enables us to do this? Can we set up or design PhD projects that enable PhD students to do this? And several of those that we spoke to were doing this work or had done this work. And again, not to overly romanticize this, of course, in the neoliberal university, time's incredibly squeezed. There's a range of time pressures. So this isn't easy, but those we spoke to still found ways to do it and still felt there were pockets of opportunity. Next is, and this is it appears a minor one, but I think it's important, and many we spoke to thought it was important for community groups. That's providing meeting spaces and printing. Meeting spaces are, the university has a surplus, has a vast amount of buildings in major cities, and community groups often struggle to find meeting spaces or to pay for meeting spaces, and academics can quite easily book those spaces and make them open for communities, particularly in the UK in places like London where central meeting spaces are hard to come by. This is a really important, if non-taxing act that a lot of people spoke of doing. And printing materials for protests and campaigns, again, something very simple that a lot of people spoke about doing, or at least those whose printing had not come to be monitored in the contemporary university of micromanagement. And then lastly, and this is my last slide before I wrap up, this social and symbolic capital and institutional affiliation. And Trevor argues that to be a doctor affords you a privilege and perspective which opens those doors. It's exploiting or working in the margins of, I would say, the privilege that is afforded from being in a university. So we derive a certain amount of status from having a doctorate or being attached to a university. How do we steal that and repurpose that for communities of resistance? And of course, this requires a degree of criticality for us to think about the ways that we play into these hierarchies in order to reap the benefits that are there to be reaped for our communities. Okay, so just before we get into some discussion, just to recap a little bit, I want to suggest that anti-racist scholar activism can be thought of as a form of decolonial practice, particularly at the moment, whilst there's a lot of waiting on universities to live up to their hollow statements in support of Black Lives Matter or their performative attempts to decolonize. I think there is work that can be done by anti-racist scholar activists within the university, or at least at the margins of the university. I think working in service to communities of resistance and engaging in theft are ways that we can do that. Working in service is a counter-hegemonic orientation. It is resistant to the capitalist logic that would see us working in service for our employers or the university, and it reminds us that we're on the side of communities of resistance. And by stealing the resources of the university to benefit communities of resistance, we can work against the university, the injustices of the university. And a few references there, and I think I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully we can have a chat.
Remi, thank you very much for the insightful presentation. There's a comment that we have, and for those of you that haven't raised questions, you feel free to ask them now if you have any questions. So there's a comment that I like. They like the concept of stealing from the university, as it is consistent with Gramsci's notion of counter-hegemony and Bayard's idea of quiet encroachment. The university cannot be changed from the inside, it can only be transformed from within. It is therefore important that the university centers such as the UK's Centre for Civil Society must continue to collaborate with community scholars. And also, there's a question on do you see decolonization only within a university space, or can it be applicable outside the university space?
So yeah, decoloniality. I think it's important that we see it as something that extends beyond the university. I don't know about in your context, but the way it's been used in the UK now, it's in danger of being bereft of any meaning. It's come to stand in for the diversification of the curriculum, basically, in the UK. And of course, there are more radical elements of the movement that are calling attention to what universities are funding, for instance, or university ties to policing or military or oil or all kinds of extractive and exploitative global processes. But I think we can draw inspiration from the decolonial or anti-colonial movements that have gone before to learn lessons for a whole range of issues in society. I think we can look at how coloniality shaped policing, for instance. We can look at racial disparities as a legacy of colonialism, and then think critically about how lessons from decoloniality can allow us to address those. So I think it's a framework that we can draw on, but I think we should be sensitive to what those decolonial or anti-colonial struggles were, the enormity of what was at stake over those struggles. And in the UK, I'd be interested to hear about context elsewhere. In the UK, I think there's a risk of us losing sight of that.
No, thank you very much for that. And I see a question here that when you look at the lenses of decoloniality from the UK perspective, do you think even in an African context, we should go through the same way as they're doing in the UK, or Africa should have its own ways of decoloniality?
That's a good question. I don't think that African universities, African activists should follow the UK. No, I think we should look at what's going on in a range of international contexts and think critically about those, and kind of draw on inspiration where necessary. But I think we should also be critical, and that, you know, there's a whole range of radical thought from the African continent. So I think I would probably suggest that the UK should more be looking to learn from African intellectuals than the other way around, since, you know, the history shows that Britain have invariably been on the wrong side of that history. But I guess what I think we should be striving for, and what I'm really looking for in my work, and is a reason I've been glad to connect with this call, and also been reading the work of some people on this call as well, is I think we should be looking to develop international networks and to think about decoloniality or anti-racism as an international endeavor. And of course, I'm not the first person to say this, and there's a whole range of movements that have done that, but I think that is absolutely key, because coloniality is a global, international set of processes or systems, so our resistance really should look to be international as well. And I know in the UK our movements are incredibly parochial, and we need, myself included, we need to get better at that. If anyone wants to come back on anything that I've asked as well, please do.
Yeah, no, if there are those that, yeah, no, I see a hand from Trevor. Trevor, you can unmute your mic and then ask your question.
Oh, thank you very much. Very interesting and inspiring,
Thank you.
especially stealing from the university. It's something we've always done, but we've done it guiltily.
Yeah.
So it's the right thing to do.
I think so.
Yeah. So, well, firstly, just to mention that in the 80s, during the struggle against apartheid, you know, NGOs and other organizations were called service organizations. So there was that rigid distinction, which, you know, was based on there's the NGOs and the mass organizations, you know, people's organizations. So I was just saying, you know, that concept of working in service is not new here in a way. So I can relate it from that. But my question is, or my discussion point is, so which politics guides the scholar activists? Because, you know, there are two levels. For example, in South Africa, the race-class debate is long. You know, now we've got the race-class gender debate, okay, with all the implications, you know. And then, so that's like, you know, content. Or also recently now, we've got Afrocentricity versus decolonization, you know, so there's a debate there, although that one I'm not so clear, but then the other issue is, so that's content, the other is method. So we've already mentioned this thing that, you know, don't align yourself too much to one social movement. So some of us do that rather than more broadly. But even when we do it more broadly, we might stick to one political line. You know, me, I'm a Marxist. And within Marxism, you know, there's various strands. So I might be quite rigid there. Almost sectarian, yeah. Or one could be more open. Even if you're a Marxist, you're open to anarchism, you know, and other strands. So that's why I'm asking the question, which politics guides the scholar activists more generally? Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. Good to be in conversation with you. Yeah, there's a few points there. So the first, I think you recognise the idea of working in service as well as the idea of theft, and I think it is important to say that these are not new. These are ideas that I've drawn on from thinkers, and those thinkers have taken them from other ideas and likely other contexts beyond the university as well. And I think a lot of the people that I spoke to were inspired by that tradition. So I think these ideas have got a long legacy that makes them robust and I think useful. So the people that I spoke to had a range of philosophies, political orientations, or and also disciplinary training. So, but I think I spoke to quite a few Black Marxists, Pan-Africanists, post-colonial theorists, critical race theorists. So although there's broad agreement, and I think everybody that I spoke to was generally anti-capitalist based on a belief that to tackle racism we have to deal with capitalism. There was some variation, but I think I would say Black Marxists and Pan-Africanists were two of the most dominant ways of thinking, and that comes from the kind of Marxist influence comes from some of our really big thinkers in the UK, like Sivanandan, who I mentioned, but also Stuart Hall. We're incredibly influenced by the US here in the UK as well, so that's another site that we draw from. Maybe too much, I don't know. But intersectional ideas were really central to a lot of the thinking of the people that I spoke to as well, and I think have a lot of value. Although there were those that also said that as well as being intersectional, we still need to cling on to the need for unity that Audre Lorde and others have spoken about. In terms of the method that you mentioned, I absolutely agree. I think it's really important that we don't align too closely or exclusively with one particular orientation or method. I think there's a range of influences and areas that we can draw inspiration from in terms of our academic work and our activism, and I think that's I think that's something that we should try to do, and it's something that I'm trying to do myself. I primarily interested in critical race theory, but increasingly I'm trying to read and think about, engage with thought from elsewhere and not be too closely wedded to that philosophy, because I think we should be kind of omnivorous in where we draw our inspirations from.
Thank you very much about that, Remi. And there's also another comment that we are fighting the same battle with the same battle, the vestiges of British imperialism. People of color from African and British university must therefore collaborate. Even Pan-Africanism, with its roots in America, fostered collaboration between Black Americans and Africans. We can learn a lot from history about collaborative struggles against white supremacy. And then the question is that in your work, are you collaborating with any of the African scholars or any scholars from that are working on African issues?
So I spent some time in Kenya about a year ago. I mean, it seems a lifetime ago with how COVID has changed things, but I started to make some connections with people there organising around, particularly around policing, but also around education. So I built up some relationships there, and a few in Ghana as well, but not enough. Again, part of what I'm trying to do with my work now is be more international, to make connections across locations. So I think it's something we need to do more, and I think those of us in places like Britain, I think it's often a lack of effort on our part. We're incredibly parochial in the way we think about race and racism, and we definitely need to get better at that.
No. Thank you very much for that, Remi. I see we don't have any further questions, so I am going to firstly thank you, Remi, for making the time and sharing the insights with us. Hopefully, this is not the last time we are hearing from you from the Center for Civil Society. Oh yeah, and I'm going to hand over to Shauna, who also I think has a question. Thank you very much, Remi.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. I was trying to raise my hand to just engage a bit with Remi. So Remi, the first thing, and Remi and everyone, the first thing I want to say is quite proudly, CCS has a long history of letting activists, community-based movements, etc., use university spaces. So we are used to getting phone calls the next morning from irate cleaning staff and RMS claiming that the space is not being respected by CCSs. And I've always been able to grin a little bit thinking of how that disrespect, what does it mean, right? What does it mean? The other thing that I wanted to ask, and not just Remi, but my other colleagues, Trevor, Sajida, other folks, you know, it's always interesting to me when students come to me with their dissertation topics and they say things like, we haven't been able to find a gap in the literature. We don't know, you know, how to do this. And I think that we do have enormous power if you have a cohort of master's students and PhD students, for example, and all of them are doing socially useful research. So we're all turning out cohorts that are doing socially useful research as opposed to research that's just filling in gaps in the literature. So how do we move to a position where we are all doing that? I'm just wondering what other colleagues, how they are handling students like that. Because I mean, I often get students who really have only a glimmer of a clue as to what they want to do, and then how it's translated into socially useful. I guess I'm not doing enough work with them on that front. But for me, that seems to be a way that we can serve community movements.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what others have to say as well. But firstly, your comment about space. Yeah, I think I'm almost reluctant to talk about it and write about it in this presentation and in the book. But I think it is, although it seems like nothing, it doesn't seem like much. It barely seems worth talking about. It is incredibly valuable, and I think community groups here in the UK find it incredibly valuable, and it's something that a lot of people speak about doing. So given the lack of access to those spaces and how those spaces are often set up to keep our communities out, I think it is important work, and it should be appreciated as such. But yeah, that there is the kind of pushback that you mentioned. We often here in the UK we have a lot of pushback around counter-terror, which obviously when we're talking about anti-racist work, it's felt particularly sharply because our communities are seen as subjects of suspicion, which sometimes makes it a little more difficult. But again, there are ways to navigate all that. In terms of your second point, this is a really, really important issue that I think it would be great if we could develop some more socially useful approaches to our research and assignments. I don't know if it's the same for you, but in the UK, we just have students doing thousands and thousands of dissertations each year that just go into, I don't even know where they go. They just go into the university vaults or repositories or whatever, and then they're never seen again. And some of the people we spoke to spoke about setting up their modules so there was direct contact with community groups working on housing, for instance, right from the start. And that dialogue was ongoing throughout the module that enabled the students to then be in conversation with those groups when it comes to the time to thinking about their assignment and getting some, not complete direction, but some dialogue in terms of what might be beneficial. So I think it's partly about opening up our classrooms to communities as well, but I think that change has to be institutional and embedded, so it's not just the odd activist orientated teacher doing this, but it's kind of embedded in the institution. But I don't know, I'm still thinking it through. I think I should have said at the outset as well, one of the things with this book is we're not really positioning ourselves as experts, but largely we're speaking to people who we're inspired by and trying to gather these insights together and reflect on our own praxis and encourage networks to develop that where we're all looking to do things better. And I think thinking about assignments and pedagogy as well will be absolutely central to that.
Thanks so much, Remi. If there aren't any more comments, then I'm just going to thank you and thank everyone for participating. I know that a lot of people have asked for us to make the recording available, so I wouldn't be surprised if you hear from some of those people a bit later once they've listened to your recording. But Remi, thanks so much for engaging with us, and we very much hope to be able to keep in touch. There's a comment from Sajida that I just want you to look at before you go. She's just saying that she would love to connect with you as there are many parallels with the work that she's doing. So if Sajida is still here, say hi, Sajida. Are you still around? Sajida's
Yes,
basic
I am.
education. Hi, Sajida.
Hi, Remi. Thank you so much. That was really thought-provoking, and we must connect. I also had a comment for you, Shauna. Perhaps
yes.
another webinar.
Yes, definitely. I see that. Thanks, Sajida. Well,
Thank you, Sajida. I look forward to connecting with you.
Thanks to everyone for participating. And Remi, we will keep in touch. Please keep well and keep safe. And everybody, please keep safe. And we will see you next week. Please join us again for our next seminar. A notice will go out soon. Bye and thanks. Andres and Dan, please stay behind.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, Remi.
Thanks,
Bye,
all.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Trevor.